What's good, everyone? In this video, we'll be visiting the Anthropic API. So we worked with a lot of the Claude models previously on this channel via Amazon Bedrock, but what I wanted to showcase in this video at least is how can we directly use the API Anthropic provides via their SDK, and we'll use the Python SDK specifically here, but if you're interested in using TypeScript or something of that sort, you'll see that there's samples around that as well. And the reason for exploring this today, right, is tool implementation and tool use is a little different with the API than you might traditionally see in different platforms that we worked with so far, such as kind of LangChain or Amazon Bedrock. So I just want to show some of the different nuances here. This isn't going to be a really long video, just a kind of understanding of how you can use this API to set up some of the same kind of use cases we've already explored. So with the Anthropic API, right, very similar to using something like OpenAI or something of that sort, you'll get started off with the API key and then just a simple kind of API call where you have your model choice and then any different parameters that you might be working with. You can think of this as temperature, whatever else it is that you might be playing around with. So kind of the same standard stuff there. Where it differs a little, right, with tool use, and this is where it gets a little interesting. With tool use, if we go the traditional kind of, let's say, LangChain type of kind of setup that we normally worked with, and I'll link that video down below too in terms of how we orchestrated tools with using LangChain as the orchestrating framework. If we use this here, right, with something like LangChain, what we always had was we had an agent, and then we had whatever tools it might be working with, and obviously in more complicated cases, as we've talked about, you'll also have multi-agent workflows, things of that sort. To keep it simple here, we'll have an agent with multiple different tools, right? And traditionally, as the input prompt comes in, as we know, the model reasons basically which tool to use, what is the appropriate tool to use for this use case, and it gets executed. So the kind of chain of thought that happens is the input comes in, appropriate tool is chosen, and then that tool is executed, and then you have a structured output that is shared basically. That's traditionally the flow that we've kind of been used to when working with tools and agents. With the Anthropic API, it's a little different in terms of how it's presented. So for Anthropic, let me switch back to blue here. With Anthropic, we will have, once again, the input, and then similarly, a tool will be chosen, but the new kind of nuance, or I guess the neat part here in terms of what Anthropic's introducing is basically you can say, once that tool is chosen, you can parse that result, so the initial result, and essentially say, you control the execution of the tool, basically. So it might be the same steps, but this step right here is in the client's control. So in your business logic, right, in whatever app you're having, right, let's say that you have an input that comes in and you know there's a certain tool that's going to be executed, or there's a certain tool that you want executed. And when that tool is chosen, right, the initial API call or API request that Anthropic makes, it actually does not execute the tool. It essentially says that, okay, based off the input, we reason that we should use this tool. And then you, as the kind of programmer here, will basically say, okay, tool choice is what was enabled here, and this is the tool that it's saying to use. Now I'm going to make another API request. So this is API request 2, where I'm saying execute the tool with this input, basically. So it's in basically once the tool has been determined to use by the initial API request, the second API request is you taking that tool's output after you execute it, basically like a Python function, and then saying, okay, execute this tool, and now give me a structured final kind of response body. So it seems like the same steps, but in reality, the control of this kind of second portion here falls in your hands. And this is powerful, right? For use cases where you want a lot more tight control and kind of oversight in terms of what the agent can do. This becomes really, really handy because one of the pitfalls we talked about, right, with agentic development and kind of having agents in real world business applications is we are giving a level of autonomy basically to the kind of agent in terms of what's happening. And here, right, we're making this a little safer where we're saying in the initial API request, just determine if a tool needs to be used. And if it's the appropriate tool that we want for this use case, right, then I will execute it and I will append that to the second API request. And then you give me the structured output. So you're getting some more control back as a programmer and as a developer in terms of what you're working with. So whenever you have something where you want to maybe more tightly kind of couple what you're working with here, then this is a great API to work with and it gives you that level of control and flexibility. Now, if all of that didn't make sense, right, like always, let's get hands-on directly. I'm going to pull up the code here, and let's go over to Cursor, our good friend, and I'll share this Git repo. And before we even go in there, this is the Anthropic docs right here. I'm just on developer guide here. And you can see very similarly, right, and we'll explore this, we'll just be installing an Anthropic SDK, and very kind of comfortably for those of you that have already worked with other kind of commercial APIs or anything of that sort, you'll see it's just a messages.create API call that we're doing. So everything is in this messages structure for Anthropic in terms of what we're going to be expecting and what we're going to be parsing essentially. So with that being said, I'll also make sure to share all these resources here. There's also the official Anthropic samples repo here. So all of this will be shared and linked down below in the description guide. But if we come here, right, into Cursor itself, we'll notice that I have an intro for the API. And if we take a quick look at this, right, it's going to be very similar to kind of how we work with any other commercial API if you used it before. I'm going to take that API key. You can kind of grab that and create it on the platform itself in that tab. And I'm just going to pass it in this messages format, basically. So this messages format right here is basically what Anthropic is expecting for its API. This is where everything's going to be structured. This is what we're going to be building basically all of our Gen AI projects around when using this API. And if I go in here real quick, let me go into, I think I'm in the wrong directory there. Let's go into the API intro. You'll see that this executes as expected. So if I do a Python 3 intro.py right there, we will see for the question, who is Roger Federer? Greatest athlete in the world should be the right answer, but we will see that we have a response out there. Pretty standard, pretty simple to understand if you've worked once again with APIs in this space before. Now the different nuances, right, that we were talking about will come into our tools intro here, and I'm going to build more samples as I get more comfortable with this API as well and the kind of message structure here. We'll come here into this main.py for this tools intro, and what we're going to do is we're going to set up some basic kind of global variables that we're working with. So we'll have the model, which is Opus 4 in this case. I think 4.1 is out now, but I have to fact check that. And if we see here, right, I'm just going to say, let's do some dummy sentiment analysis with the dummy tool that I provide for you. Obviously, it's going to be a very inaccurate tool. I just want to show you how you can port over any custom tools or custom code that you might have that you want to implement with the Anthropic API. So in the system prompt, I'm just going to be clarifying that, saying that use the Scent Analyzer tool that I provide for any queries related to sentiment analysis. Anything else, just use your general knowledge and abilities. And then very similarly, like I would in the LangChain framework, LangGraph framework, wherever you're coming from, I just define a Python function saying we're expecting a string, basically some input text. And what we're going to return is basically in this dummy function, if the length, using the Python function, Python length function right there, if it's greater than 30, basically return a positive sentiment. Otherwise, return that it's a negative sentiment. Obviously not accurate whatsoever in this case, but that's what we specify here. Now for Anthropic, right, the function itself is not enough. You also have to define basically the specs in terms of what you're expecting for the input and the output and what's required for the schema. So this makes it once again very hard for the model to kind of, obviously any model is prone to errors, but this once again gives even more tightly coupled schema. And I think you should also define that, right? So if you're using Pydantic, for example, to make it more strictly typed so it's clear, those are all best practices that you should keep regardless of whether you're using the Anthropic API or anything else. So here I'm just going to name this Scent Analyzer. That's what my tool name is going to be. I'm going to give it a description, and then I'm going to define the input schema here. So for the input schema, I'm basically going to say the type that we're expecting is string. You can think of this as phrase. That's what's going to be required. We do need that input text no matter what. I'm going to describe what that is there basically. Now that that's been defined, right, we have our actual tool definition. But once again, like I said, tool execution falls into the hands of the developer itself and the business logic that you're defining. So if we see here, once again, similar to like I was in the intro, I'm going to grab the API key, set up my model basically, and I'm going to define my tool as that spec right here that I'm dealing with, this get sentiment tool right here. And if we see here, once I've defined that, I'm going to basically build out that messages API just like we were in the intro call. And I'm going to have the query right here analyze the sentiment of the following text high, and this should be negative basically because of the way our function is defined. And if you see, there's going to be a initial request that we pass, but it's not the only one that we're going to be doing here. In the initial request, we pass that, and we basically pass in our system prompt, our model, and there's a few different tool choice options that you can basically define. So if you want to force it to use a specific tool, I don't remember exactly which one correlates to what. There's auto, any, and another option. We'll define that more closely as we play with it, but you can define that basically to kind of, once again, give even more control to yourself in terms of what tool needs to be executed. But essentially, we're defining that and we're passing in our different tools that we're working with here. And now, right, initially when we get a response back, this actually does not answer our question or execute the tool. What it does is in this last content type right here, and I'm going to run this so that we can see this body directly here as well. I think I had it right there. The wrong directory there. 1 second. Let's get into the tools intro, and then let's execute our main function. And I'm going to log all this out just so that you can kind of see what's happening here too. But initially what's happening here, right, is this content block that we're parsing, and they're called content blocks, I believe, within Anthropic specifically. This content block is either going to say that the type is text, meaning that we did not use a tool actually, we in reality just gave an output here. Otherwise, as expected in this case, based off the tool specs that we've defined, you should use a tool. And in the case that you do use a tool, we've built another function here basically to handle that tool call. So if we come in here, right, and I'm going to once again map all of this over in terms of what we're seeing. In this handle tool call, if you'll notice, what I'm going to do is I'm going to append to that initial messages API structure with that content block. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to execute the tool myself. So I'm going to parse that content block that came back from the initial API, and I'm going to parse the input, and I'm going to run my sent analyzer function that I've defined here with that input basically. So now that I know that Claude decided to use the tool that I wanted it to use, I'm going to execute it, and I'm going to get the output from that tool, and I'm going to reappend that to the messages. So the appending that's happening here basically is, number one, the content block that's generated from the initial API request saying we should be using a tool. And then the last appending that's happening here is basically is the actual result of the tool, which we executed ourselves with the Python function that we defined. So it's a bit of a different flow here, right? In LangChain or something else, you can imagine there's just one request that we're working with. And obviously this is a little more work, but it's for a reason. It's so that we have that extra control to kind of avoid some of the errors that might come in an agent-driven application. So once we append that and we work with that, we have our final messages API structure, and that's when we run this API request here, and we'll see that we can then parse that for the proper output. So before that proper output, right, all those steps need to occur where you handle that tool use, and you'll see that within this too, right? So here, for example, when I'm printing, Claude wants to use a tool, we'll see that this is the tool that we want to use. In this case, there's obviously only one option, but we can see that, and we can see the input that comes back from that initial content block, basically. And when we take that content block, like I said, this is phrase is what we're parsing for, this key right here. And then we'll see that in this function. We parse for that there. And then we run our sent analyzer function on that, basically. And we append this, and you can see this as the final kind of appended tool message with what we're working with. And once we've done that, basically, right, we'll see in our content, this is what returned from our function as expected, being negative sentiment. We can then run through this, and then finally the assistant, right, just because we told it in the system prompt for sentiment analysis not to return anything but the actual output here, we'll see the final output is negative sentiment as expected for shorter text based off our tool call that we've defined. So yeah, I think that was mainly what I wanted to cover today. Just a bit of an introduction to Anthropic API. I've been playing with it lately. I want to make maybe another series around this. I know I keep starting a lot of series that I'm not finishing, but my mind just kind of moves all over the place for the most part. But yeah, hopefully this was a useful introduction for anyone who wanted to use the Anthropic API and build with it. Hopefully nothing embarrassing showed up on that side panel there. But any questions, any feedback, feel free to leave down below as always, and I'll do my best to get back to it. I'll come back with more and more in this space. I think there's a lot of cool stuff happening with this API that we can build out. So stay tuned for more. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you as always, and I'll be back shortly.